Dr. Anthony Capello, Professor Franklin, Father Freda. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your generous introduction, for those of you who remember it. I'm very modest about that. I'm reminded of what Winston Churchill said of the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Attlee is a very modest man with much to be modest about. I do not address you as churchmen or dissenters, as Roman Catholics or Protestants, as Jews or Gentiles, but I speak to you as mortals and yet immortals. Those are the words of the very first sermon delivered on this land. The Reverend Richard Johnson continued, "The gospel proposes a free and gracious pardon for the guilty, cleansing to the polluted, healing to the sick, happiness to the miserable, and even life for the dead." The Reverend Richard Johnson had been ordained after the Bishop of Oxford was persuaded to do so by William Wilberforce and John Newton. John Newton was the author of those wonderful hymns, particularly Amazing Grace. He was a converted slave trader who, on his Christian conversion, became a clergyman. William Wilberforce, as you know, led the struggle to finish the slave trade and to make slavery illegal. It was on the 3rd of February, 1778, under a great tree near the harbour on what is now Castlereagh Street and Hunter Street. It was very well attended, particularly because Governor Phillip had directed, "No man shall be absent on any account whatsoever." A century and a half before, Pedro Ferdinand de Quiros, had given our country its name, Australia del Espiritu Sancto, Australia of the Holy Spirit. I have, ladies and gentlemen, 3 points to make. The founders of this country were imbued with Judeo-Christian values. The institutions which they gave us were also formed with Judeo-Christian values, and we thrived under those institutions. And finally, the defence of Australia has centred on defending those Judeo-Christian values. There is a corollary from all that. It's not surprising that we have been, we are, and we will always in a struggle, a perpetual struggle, to preserve, to protect, and to defend the Judeo-Christian values on which the country is built. The institutions which the British brought had their most recent birth in that extraordinary constitutional settlement in 1688 in England, the Glorious Revolution, which is sometimes portrayed as a religious settlement. It was really the choice between constitutionalism and following the absolute monarchy that Louis XIV had established on France. To suggest it is a Protestant sectarian conclusion is a mistake. In the old Stormont Parliament in Northern Ireland, there used to be a painting. It showed the Pope, Innocent XI, blessing William III. Innocent and William III were in alliance together against Louis XIV. Alan Atkinson, the historian, says that the two great issues that dominated the conversation of polite and ambitious men and women in England at the time were firstly the status of blacks in the empire, and secondly penal discipline. Two men stand out in the settlement of Australia. One was the Secretary of State for Colonies, Viscount Sidney, after whom the city is named, and the other is Phillip. Sidney was attached very much to constitutionalism, but there is an interesting story which tells you the character of Sidney. It's the story of one Susanna Holmes, a young woman who was sentenced to death for for robbery, stealing a minor item. Her sentence was commuted, as the sentences were. It was a concession, for those days a liberal concession. Her sentence was commuted for a term of 14 years. The story also of a young man, Henry Cable, also convicted of a crime, also with his sentence commuted. They were both to be sent to America, but America by that time had gained its independence, and they were held over. In prison, apparently relations in prison were not as rigorous as they are today, because they fell in love in prison. They managed to have a baby called Henry. When Susanna Holmes was to be sent to join the First Fleet, and she arrived at the ship, the captain refused to take the baby. Her jailer, who came with her, saw that she was absolutely devastated. He was frightened that she would take her own life. And he did an extraordinary thing. He took a stagecoach to London. He took the baby on his knee, and he rushed to London to try and find the Secretary of State for Colonies, Lord Sidney. And fortunately, he found him on the steps of the Home Office. And Lord Sidney was greatly affected by this, and immediately ordered that the child should be restored to the mother, that she should be taken to Sydney. And this was picked up, strangely, by the newspapers. And a society lady, Lady Cadogan, began a public subscription. And she raised the grand sum of £20. Well, I've done two calculations on that, one using the retail price index, which tells me that it's worth $3,500 today. But then when I used average weekly earnings, I found it was worth $41,000. Whatever it was a lot of money. And they bought some goods. They gave them to one of the ship's captains to hold in custody for them to be returned to them in Sydney. Now I will return to that in a moment. But remember that Sidney was a very concerned man, and in particular he was very much influenced by the arguments beginning in England at that time that slavery should be ended. Philip was a similar man. Philip wrote in his diary, "The laws in this country will be those introduced from the moment His Majesty's forces take possession. And there's to be one principle, that there can be no slavery in a free land and consequently no slaves." It was the work of Sidney and also the work of Philip which resulted in our continent being the only continent in the world which never knew that terrible institution, slavery. It's interesting, as Keith Windschuttle observed in Quadrants a couple of years ago, it's very strange indeed that historians rarely mention the fact that Philip and Sidney were such humanitarians. We were fortunate indeed that they were the founders of the colony of New South Wales.